Good morning, ladies and gents. My name is Simon Brown, hosting this webcast this morning. I've got two guests who will be taking most of the questions. Jason Swartz, Portfolio Manager at Old Mutual Investment Group. Khaya Sithole, independent socio-political commentator. We're looking at the elections, which are now just over 2 months away, 2 months and a couple of days. Look at the impact in terms of our election. 30 years into democracy, it is a big election. A lot of expectation as to whether the ANC will or won't drop below 50%. What that means, if it's meaningful, we'll certainly delve into that. And of course, markets. What are markets going to be doing ahead of the elections? What are they looking for during the election? And then post-elections, what can we expect from markets? And big things such as grey listings, such as our investment, sub-investment grade rating from the rating agencies. Are we going to see any potential changes there? What about the currency? But we'll get into that. Certainly, we've got a lot of time for questions. So if you've got questions, drop them into the Q&A box. We can take those. I will pick those as we're going along. If they're pertinent to that particular point in the conversation, I'll take the question immediately. Otherwise, I'll come back to it a little bit later. But Khaya, let me start with you. I say it's 30 years into democracy. It was 1994 when we, and I say we, obviously the older in the audience, queued up on that 27, 28 April to vote for the first democratic election. This is an important election, maybe not so much because it's 30 years, but because of the expectation of a lot of new parties coming in. We've got independent candidates and the prospect of the ruling ANC potentially dropping below 50%. Khaya, if I can put that to you first.
Yep. Yes, yeah. So no, thank you very much for that. So yes, you are right. It is definitely a big moment. And I think obviously what makes it a big moment is that it is probably an intersection of a couple of key factors. The first one is obviously the fact that the recent trends of general elections indicate that the ANC is indeed on a downward trajectory. Now, whether this will be the moment where it finally crosses below that line of 50%, that is a big litmus test over the next couple of weeks. But it's also an important election given the diversity of options that now do exist on the ballot box for many citizens. And for a long time, one of the problems that we found is that even citizens who felt that the incumbent political party was not catering to their needs, they also then argued that, well, the two biggest competitors that it had, which is the DA and the EFF, also were not offering particularly compelling alternatives. And what that created was a big part of the electorate that felt really paralyzed by the system, that felt that there wasn't really space for them to engage because they just didn't see something that resonated with them. Now, obviously, the big problem with that is always reality is that there's never going to be a political party that creates or provides the perfect manifesto. And even if they did, it will simply be a matter of it being on paper. There's never going to be a practical way in which all of these competing interests can be implemented. So what one hopes is that voters then look at the combination of parties that may go to parliament and say, well, even if nobody caters to everything that I need, I think if these people are represented in parliament or these particular parties are represented in parliament, there's a strong chance that the things that matter most to me will be thoroughly canvassed during that 5-year period. And of course, that should be a basis for me choosing one of those particular parties. So we're hoping that's what it's going to be. But I think obviously the fact that the democracy is maturing and the fact that independent candidates are there means that there's a bit more diversity. Whether that translates to more people participating on election day is something that we hope we're actually going to see materializing in the next couple of months.
Yeah, and I take your point around our democracy maturing. I mean, 30 years, we're proud of our democracy as a country, make no mistake about that. But of course, you know, if we look at many other democracies further abroad, 30 years is fairly young in that process. A quick point around the MK party, former President Zuma, they won their case. They're going to be on the ballot. Is your sense, are they going to be as big a deal, perhaps, as some early indications are?
I'm not convinced, and I think the reality here is that this is the one political party that has taken the great gamble of really purposing its mission around one particular individual and one particular candidate. So the case that we've just seen concluded was actually a case between the ANC and the IEC based on whether the IEC had followed its own rules in the registration of the party. The case that starts tomorrow is a case between the MK party and the ANC itself, and that's really a trademark issue. But I think whichever way that case goes, the MK party will be on the ballot, because if they have to change their logo in order to get there, then that'll be a much easier thing to do. Now, the question of whether their own candidate is actually allowed to be a member of parliament, that remains an open question. And the answer universally is that he's simply not allowed to, because he has a conviction that he served after the advent of the new constitution, which makes it very clear that only 5 years after the expiry of the sentence that he served, would he then be eligible to stand. Now, problem with that is that obviously there have been some concerning threats from members of the MK party to say, well, if you deny our candidate the right to stand in this election, there's going to be chaos. And when they say chaos, they simply say July 2021 is going to be what we see again. Now, obviously, this creates a lot of anxieties, particularly for people like you and I who are from KZN, who probably have some memories of what happens when election time violence manifests, and that's not something that we're hoping to see. So obviously, one has to then observe this one with a keen level of interest to see how they actually manage to navigate that simple question of the purpose the party around a personality and an individual who is actually not eligible to stand as a member of parliament. But that doesn't stop them, to be clear, from having his face on the ballot, because even the IFP has said that they're going to use their late leader as a face on the ballot. So a face on the ballot is not the same thing as a person standing for parliament. So they can ride the Jacob Zuma bandwagon as the face and the image of the party, but after the 29th of May, he actually then there are new hurdles for him to become a member of parliament.
Yeah, and I don't know. I think our politicians are old, and former president is old as well. Maybe sometime in Nkandla. Jason, let's bring it back to you in terms of markets and the sort of overview where we're sitting at this point. It's been, I mean, if I look at markets, I mean, if we look at the South African context, obviously commodities a big player. Gold has been doing well. Not much else has in that regard. Our rand has been, frankly, fairly stable, although our market is down a couple of percentage points so far this year. I don't know how much that is fears around the election versus just looking at what have been tough results coming through so far after a tough 2023, load shedding, water crisis, high inflation, high interest rates.
I definitely think there's an element of nervousness in investors sitting on the sidelines and waiting till the election outcome. And as you pointed out, if you look at our domestic fundamentals, it's not great. Growth has been low. A lot of issues around Eskom, around Transnet, and whereas global assets have actually been doing really well. So that's the kind of dilemma that investors face. Do we continue to look offshore for expensive asset classes that are showing continued resilience, or are there opportunities domestically? And I think the risk premium that's embedded in some of the local assets are reflecting a lot of uncertainty around the elections. SA equities have been languishing. SA bonds have been, yields have been drifting higher, and I just think that's some sort of nervousness and cautiousness around domestic investors that are looking for clarity around some of the election outcomes and what those policy implications mean in terms of the long-term growth for South Africa. And even though I would say fundamentals aren't terrible, I think it makes sense for investors now to, what's probably been reflected in prices are just kind of stepping back a little bit, waiting for some more clarity around, what the implications are for the political economy and trend growth for South Africa.
And you mentioned bonds there, and the cliche is local bonds. I mean, in fact, suddenly we're seeing bonds the world over. I mean, even the US 10-year suddenly is actually offering some real return. But locally, those bonds are offering the cliched sort of equity return without that equity risk, which has been something that's been a long time since I've seen bonds so attractive, and since I've been investing into them just for that yield at this point.
The 10-year yield in South Africa is around 12%. So on a real basis, really attractive and risk adjusted, I think can offer compelling returns. If you compare it to global or let's say US 10-year bonds, which is at 4.3, which has become more attractive, but I think there's still a lot of supply issues around US deficits that'll probably keep yields high. But I think the key risk for holders of South African bonds have been some of the longer term fiscal risks. I think the short term fiscal consolidation story has been good, and our inflation risk has started to moderate. So we are looking for cuts, which will be good for bond yields. But I think the market is kind of looking through a good budget, looking through the Jafekra kind of tailwind, and thinking about long-term, what is the implication of an election outcome that could be a little bit more left-leaning, could be a little bit more populist? How does that change the fiscal path in terms of taxes, in terms of revenue collection? And so those are some of the key risks that we're thinking about, at least in the short term. From a cyclical perspective, we think bonds offer really attractive yields. Probably not equity-like returns at this point, but happy to hold them and perhaps hedge some of that tail risks through perhaps currency derivatives.
Khaya, I want to bring back to you. Jason talks here around the markets, and some caution perhaps is the better word. If we look at voters on the ground, I mean, is there a sense of I don't know, almost like it hardly matters, the ANC, if not 50, is going to be 48, it doesn't matter? Is there a sense of excitement? You mentioned that sort of the two major alternatives, the DA and the EFF, sort of have become lackluster in many voters' minds. Is there a growing swell of this is an important election and an exciting election? I love elections. They excite me, but I might just be the nerd in the room.
No, it's a difficult one. And I think one of the more common messages that we've heard from political parties in recent months is this idea that 2024 is, our 1994, for example. And what that seeks to do is that it obviously seeks to touch into the pulse of many people who understood how important the 1994 election was and understood why it was important for them to participate in it. Now, the problem that we have, unfortunately, with 2024 is that if one looks back and does a direct comparison with 1994, in 1994, you had a very clear, universal, touch point about what everybody wanted to be able to achieve and why everyone understood the importance of the ballot at that particular stage. What we've unfortunately seen in the past 30 years is that the currency of the ballot has diminished somewhat. And when I said the currency of the ballot has diminished, in 1994, it was very clear. You had absolutely no doubt in anyone's mind that if you wanted to be able to usher in a new government, the ballot was the way in which you're going to do it. And there was going to be a very strong sense of linearity between the inputs and the outcomes. What unfortunately has happened in South Africa in the past 30 years is that many citizens have started to question the currency of the ballot. And what we mean by that is that there is a bit of a gap between the participation in an electoral process and the ability to influence some of the more important things that one wants to be able to see, whether in their community or whether in their provinces or even in national government. And an example of that is that if you then look at how many service delivery protests we have in South Africa on a daily basis versus, how they accumulate over time, there is a disturbing trend that you'll find. And the trend is that there are many more service delivery protests that happen, but very few of them make it to the public arena or at least get reported on. And the ones that we hear about, the ones that get reported on, are the ones that tend to be violent in nature. And the secondary problem that we've then seen is that after a couple of incidences that have resulted in the state responding in relation to service delivery protests, what we've seen is that there's a validation of those alternative mechanisms as the best way to get a response from the government. So if you remember, in 2016, it was a municipal demarcation board that went to communities in Limpopo and said, look, we're going to redraw the municipal boundaries. And of course, citizens had to be consulted. And after they were consulted, the MDP still said that we're going to do it our own way. So they felt that the process of consulting, the process of engagement was not actually resulting in their voices being heard. So when they started burning schools, the state still didn't listen when they burned the first school. It was after 33 schools had been burned when suddenly somebody said, we've got a problem here. Similarly, if you look at back what happened in 2018, the president's first trip to the United Kingdom was actually cut short. And why it was cut short is that the ANC in the Northwest engaged in yet another factional civil war. So what they said is that they went to Luthuli House, they complained about the people that were leading them there, and they didn't get any joy from Luthuli House. So what they then did is that they said they're going to burn public infrastructure in the Northwest in order to get the attention of the ANC leaders. And when the president then said that he's going to abandon his own international trip and come and address that, you can imagine the optics of people saying, hold on, this is a consultation, the process of engagement don't get you there. But as soon as you threaten public resources, as soon as you burn down public infrastructure, then you get a response. And the danger with that is that we are simply validating these alternative mechanisms of engagement, where a person says, well, what's the point of me going to the ballot box in order to say I have a problem with this, because nothing ever happens once you voted. We're still stuck with the same councillor, we're still stuck with the same leader for a 5-year period. However, if we do things differently, the state is more responsive, and then you get our issues addressed, even if it must fall as a manifestation of that. And why that all matters is that now, if you are then going to try and say that 2024 is a new 1994, you have to somehow position the ballot box as the single most important instrument of getting things to change. And far too many people simply feel that the system is just too lethargic. The system is simply non-responsive. So therefore, this is not the type of thing that says, it's important for me to wake up on the 29th of May because issue 1, 2, or 3 that matters most to me will only be addressed if I not only participate, but I participate in a particular way. So whether a person thinks the issue that matters most to them is the employment, the energy crisis, or whatever their issues are, very few people are able to map that to say, wait, the only way to address load shedding, for example, is for me to show up and to vote in a particular way. So the resonance and the currency of the ballot in 2024 is very different to what it was in 1984.
I'll take your point on that. And Jason, to bring it back to you, if we look at things, for example, our grey listing, our sub-investment grade from the rating agencies, Moody, Standard & Poor's and the like, is there going to be a fundamental shift? And I'm thinking, if we take a scenario, even where the ANC's sub 50%, and even if they're fairly chunky sub 50%, they get into a coalition. I mean, the economic cluster within the government is not going to fundamentally change. And truthfully, you referenced the budget of last month. I mean, we've had I was going to say we've had excellent finance ministers. There's been some exceptions over the years, but I mean, we're not going to. Our governor of the Reserve Bank is in place for another 5 years. Same at SARS. We might get a new finance minister, but there's not going to be massive changes just because of the election and the ANC's waiting in Parliament thereafter. Surely.
Shouldn't be. I guess it really just depends on where the ANC lands. If they do land in the kind of lower 40%, then their reliance on, I guess, larger opposition parties, is bigger. And there you've got two tail risks of, do they need to partner up with the EFF? And you've seen some of the kind of municipal coalitions, how messy that's been. Or should it be the DA? I think in either case, you would hope that the institutions like the central bank, SARS, National Treasury remain fairly independent, and still, monetary policy and fiscal policy stays pretty orthodox. I guess is the nervousness that people are thinking about is that, those entities, are being used in a more populist way. So, does fiscal policy perhaps change? EFF, have quite radical views around independence of the central bank, monetary policy, and some kind of constitutional issues. So, the hope is that, we maintain our regulatory framework around the independence of these institutions, and because of that, credit rating agencies won't have to downgrade us. It won't cause a pop in our yields, which would also then cause further fiscal challenges down the road. But it really just depends on how that coalition dynamic evolves around if the ANC gets into the low 40s and they can't get over the line using smaller parties, they have to, partner with bigger opposition parties where the policy outcomes are diametrically opposed. And I think that's what the market's really grappling with at the moment.
And is there perhaps then it's almost a case of that the market is less worried about where the ANC falls, although I take your point, the percentage points, which matters. But maybe the market's more worried about an EFF getting into Parliament, alongside the ANC, and they forming a coalition, and that's a big worry. And that an ANC coalition with almost anybody else will make the market happier than a coalition with the economic freedom fighters.
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, it is a tail risk event, but it's still not clear, whether the ANC's preference, towards EFF versus DA, how much different that is. The market, because of the uncertainty, the market is, I think, pricing in some level of populism and left-leaning policies. So the radical approaches of EFF around land reform and independence of some of these institutions, I think really make global investors pretty nervous. I think there's a lot of issues that global investors are waiting for around what's happening with the Fed, what's happening around US elections, and for them to look at emerging markets and the risk appetite towards South Africa specifically. The market reaction to an EFF coalition with the ANC, I think, will be pretty disastrous from a risk premium perspective. We'll see that in the rand, we'll see that in bond yields, we'll see that in capital outflows. So it's still a tail risk. It's something that you probably want to hedge towards, but you can see an element of that being reflected in prices already.
Khaya, I want to bring it back to you. I was chatting with the CEO of SASFIA today, South African Special Risk Insurance Association, Mpumi Tikwe, and we were talking around July 2021, and he made the point, and this was from the commissions that came out post those July riots as well in 21, that it was the slow response of the security cluster. And Sean is asking a question which says, is the security cluster going to deal with potential, or not potential, with violence if we see it, particularly if it is MK? I mean, is there appetite from the government and most notably the security cluster to be on the ball and to be responsive? Because a lot around July 2021 was the lack of action from security cluster and simply nothing happening for I mean, there were 2 days before we sort of started to see any response.
The problem that we have with July 2021 is that it's not immediately clear if the government has taken stock of what happened, what went wrong, and what needs to be done differently in order for this not to be repeated. So if you listen to, or if you revisit some of the testimonies that we saw in the commission that was convened in order to try and understand what went on then, it became very clear that one of the biggest problems that we have is the disconnect between what ought to be intelligence structures, what the defense structures are supposed to, and what the general policing is. And I think obviously the biggest weakness was the fact that it kept being reiterated, and this is something that we've heard since Marikana, that our public order policing is completely in dire straits. And what that simply means is that when a political party decides to mobilize against around particular hotspots, you want the public order policing to be the first respondents. They have to be adequately prepared in order to be able to deal with that. And we are not sure whether we've learned anything from Marikana or whether we've learned anything from July 2021. The danger with that is that obviously the second layer of defense would obviously be marshalling the army itself. And we now know what the risks are associated with marshalling the army, because we saw that during COVID-19 in particular, and also in the responses to July 2021, in that, again, South Africa doesn't seem to know when are the right times or the right avenues for marshalling or deploying the army in order to be able to deal with what should really be a policing matter. So unless somebody puts evidence that indicates that we've learned since 2021, that we've done things differently, that we're better prepared, the risk remains remarkably high. But what was also quite interesting is that July 2021 essentially was an ad hoc mobilization. In other words, it was simple people who felt there was a point to take for, rather than people who are saying that we are doing so on behalf or in defense of a particular political party. So what would be different in going forward is that obviously, because there's now a political party structure behind it, it probably has as much groups as any other political party. If they then decide that no, this should be the way in which we mobilize, then they'll be better coordinated. And that for me creates a great fear, because if you can think of July 2021 being as uncoordinated as it was and the damage that we saw there, imagine if there's much more coordination behind those that say there's a problem that needs to be fixed here. I think the risk would be even higher, and I'm not convinced. I haven't seen any evidence that our security architecture is better prepared this time compared to where they were 3 years ago.
Yeah, no, I take your point on that. Khaya, I want to stay with you a moment and run some scenarios. An ANC Well, plus 50% is broadly business as usual, although, of course, we'll see what would potentially happen with President Ramaphosa's position if they did incredibly poorly. An ANC at 48% coalition with a small party or two will get them across the line. That should be easy enough. Hopefully, they've learned some lessons from places like Ekurhuleni, Thekwini, and the like. But what about an ANC in the low 40s? Do they have appetite to do a coalition with the Democratic Alliance? And as importantly, does the Democratic Alliance have appetite to do a coalition with the party, with the ANC?
Yeah, it's a remarkably difficult situation for both parties to countenance. And the reason it becomes quite difficult for them is that part of their political capital over the past 20 to 25 years has been on positioning themselves as the antidote to the other. So you must go with us because those other ones are going to do something so completely out of kilter that it will undermine whatever progress that we have made as society since then. So the idea of them then having to work together is something that anecdotally insiders within those parties would frown upon. But the reality here is that because we've got a political system that says that we are only going to the ballots on the 29th of May and we have to work with the results that we receive on the 29th of May, there has to be an appetite for engagement. And when we call it an appetite for engagement, it is simply the question of the answer won't always be let us get into a coalition government, because that comes with particular trade-offs that some of these parties may not be willing to concede on. So whether it's putting together something that sounds like a government of national unity that simply says, well, actually, we will coordinate or we will, we will collaborate on particular issues, on particular action points, rather than getting into an eternal marriage, then that's the one possibility. Obviously, the risk associated with that is that if the issues that need to be engaged on remain as polarizing as we understand the ANC and the DA to be, then it simply means that that collaboration won't result in much. But of course, what that simply then means is that we're probably going to remain with much of what we have, much of what you've seen. And what that simply means is that there was an article a couple of weeks ago, which I thought was rather irresponsible, that said, for example, that if the DA comes into power, they're going to abolish affirmative action laws. And my first anxiety was to say, well, a person who writes that article should have actually done a simple litmus test of trying to understand what it takes to actually pass a law in South Africa, what it takes to revoke a law, and what it takes to propose a new law. And the evidence that's been collected by the Parliamentary Monitoring Group, PMG, is that the process of making laws in South Africa is remarkably slow. So if you look at the differences between the Section 75, 76, and 77 bills, for example, the processes they tend to take forever because of the public consultation processes and perhaps the ANC's own inability to usher in, the lawmaking process. The only bills that actually take the shortest time possible to pass are the money bills. And the simple reason the money bills take the shortest time to pass is that very few people bother to engage in them. And by the time they engage in them, National Treasury said, well, this is what needs to happen, and it's very unlikely that they're ever going to change their position. And the relevance of that is that imagine that the ANC, which has never needed anyone's concurrence in order to pass a particular law, takes such a long time to get there. It is difficult to imagine that in a broken structure where no one has the unilateral capacity to usher in a law through the legislative processes, it's difficult to imagine that those laws will be faster. So the reason I think that matters is that we are probably stuck in the long run, or at least in the medium term, with the laws as they currently exist. And all that one can sort of hope to see is a better execution around those particular laws. So within an ANC and the DA alliance, or an ANC and a DA collaboration, it is unlikely that the ANC would let go or cede on some of its most treasured, policy pronouncements over the past 2 decades or so and say, okay, we're going to ditch this law because the DA says otherwise. I think the problem would be that they still have an eye on 2029 to say, well, if this doesn't work out, we should still be in a position to, in 2029, to say to our members, to say to our voters, actually, we need to be in control of the state in order for the state to be functional. So you cannot spend the next 5 years then jettisoning off all the things that make you distinct as a party and then hope that in 2029 you still stand a chance, because you can't get to 2029 and people legitimately saying, well, actually, we can't see a difference between the ANC and the DA. So it would not be an easy marriage if it materializes. It will simply be a matter of we'll collaborate on points of common interest and everything else. We're just going to have to toss a coin and see what happens in Parliament, convince other parties on an issue-by-issue basis. A very complicated way of running things, but the only practical one if the two parties want to retain their identities beyond 2024 all the way to 2029.
Yeah, in a sense, that's partly, I think, in part what happened to the Liberal Democrats in the UK when they went into a coalition with Nick Clegg, who now works for Meta instead of in politics. Jason, if I bring it back to you, and again around the sort of the 50%, and there is perhaps too much sort of obsession around the ANC at 50+1 or 50-1. Is there not also a scenario out there where markets are looking for a free and fair election? And that's certainly something which South Africa can be proud of. We've got the IEC, they're a reputable institution, they've got budget challenges, but that's not unique to the IEC or to South Africa necessarily. But a scenario in which the ANC accepts the election. Is there not perhaps some sort of worry out there that the test here is what does the ANC do if they lose, and that if they get sub 50 and they go with the DA or perhaps it's the IFP or one of the other smaller parties, a sense of a litmus test that democracy in South Africa is robust and works, and that gives more faith to international investors when looking at our markets?
I certainly think that could be a positive perspective. The fact that the ANC is in panic mode at the moment, and they doing things like trying to keep the lights on and the ICJ case. I mean, besides the fact that that could be a legitimate case, but it shows that the ANC would be ready to accept the IEC's accuracy of their votes. Which I think will be a positive indication, and it means that we're not a Zimbabwe or the like, where I forget that party's name, but they basically stole the election. So I think there definitely is a perspective, a positive perspective to take out of that. I do also think that the ANC falling below 50% or just accepting what the outcome is could have a positive impact, given I would say almost negative expectations embedded in the outcome, in that when there is such massive dispersion and uncertainty around it, the market tends to embed or lean towards more negative outcomes, and one where the ANC just falls below 50, smaller parties get it over 50%, but there isn't any election interference, everything runs smoothly. I think the status quo around policy continuity and just the realization that the ANC actually needs to, turn itself around in certain ways. I mean, a good ANC is actually good for the country. So them realizing that they need to improve in terms of their governance, I think will be positive, and definitely from a global perspective, that outcome could have a good outcome.
Ladies and gents, if you've got any questions, you're welcome to drop them into the Q&A box, either for Khaya or Jason. We've certainly got some time in the webcast for these. Jason, I want to stay with you, and I don't know if you and your colleagues at Old Mutual Investment Group are sort of doing your own scenarios and almost polling in terms of expectations for the outcome on the 29th of May.
We certainly do look at polls. I think the polling data is getting more and more credible, and obviously with MK coming in, it kind of does throw the numbers out a little bit. We ran some numbers last year. We took a bit of a quantitative approach, which was fairly overkill, but I think that the nuance in it was that, thinking about coalition politics and the complexity and dynamics of how parties partner together, we created, I guess, a probability matrix of each party's propensity to work with another party based on historic municipality coalitions or what they've said explicitly, like Action SA won't work with ANC example. And so we ran a whole bunch of simulations through this matrix and came up with a bunch of scenarios. And I mean, you can debate the value of that, but I think what it did say now more than ever is that the dispersion of outcomes is as wide as possible. And that certainly for us means that we need to focus on tail events. What could happen if the ANC partners with opposition parties that cause diametrically opposed policy action. So definitely it's an ongoing conversation. I think a lot of asset managers are thinking about their positioning, specifically when it comes to domestic SA facing equity positioning, when it comes to being overweight SA assets, being overweight SA bonds, what type of scenarios will you need to perhaps hedge those positions in, or what type of scenarios would you then want to take some profit from a cyclical perspective? And it's all very fluid, and data is coming in, I guess, on a weekly basis. So it's a conversation, an ongoing conversation for us.
Yeah, I think pretty much until 30 May when we start getting results. Khaya, I want to bring you in on that point around polling, and Jason made the point that polling in South Africa has gotten better. Of course, polling is not predictive. The margin of error is usually 3.5%, which in the election is massive. I look at the US election, and they've got the two primary candidates, Trump and Biden, within percentage points of each other, which means the outcome ultimately is going to be a potential polling error. I also 2019, the last national election, the ANC did 57.5%, which for them was a disaster story. But for them to drop below 50 now is a significant slide, and they lose 8%. They're still at 49.5. What's your take on the polls that you've seen and the sense of where we're actually starting to get a good data point? I mean, is it a given that the ANC is below 50? Is it well below 50 or just a sliver below 50?
Yeah, so unlike Jason, I've become a bit concerned about the latest polling data that you're seeing. And I think obviously some of the challenges that we have with the polling data that emerges is that there actually isn't a singular reference point or reference window that every single poll agency says, let us all go and do our respective polls on this particular day and actually see if any of this data can be reconciled. And the reason that matters is that obviously, if I release a poll today, the very first thing that citizens are supposed to question before they actually look at the results is what the sampling pool was and what the sampling period was. And you can imagine that a poll that was started before December 16 is a poll that does not know that MK is going to exist. So if you do that poll in a place like KZN and if you do that poll in a place like Limpopo, the answers are completely different. So if you do the same thing after today, then of course that same audience may give you very different outcomes. But I think for a lot of us, when you see a poll, there isn't that singular reference point that says, oh, by the way, this poll was taken at this particular snapshot window. This is who it's sampled, and this is therefore why it differs from that poll, or why it's better, or in some cases worse than the other poll. So I think unless there is a universal understanding of how polling works, what you're going to see is that every single political party is going to cherry pick the one poll that sounds like it favors them and then call that the most legitimate poll that people must be able to listen to. And of course, for citizens who are trying to make decisions based on that particular information set, it's not helpful for everyone to be trying to outshine another based on shifting fundamentals. So we do have an issue relating to the polling data. And in fact, one of the more recent polls that came out a couple of weeks ago seemed to indicate that the MK party will be at around 13% nationally. I mean, the idea of a new party with a candidate who isn't even eligible to stand for parliament getting a 13% share of the national ballot in the absence of any document that explains what they're going to do, it did sound a bit ambitious from my viewpoint. But the problem that we all have to grapple with is the fact that everybody's polling mechanisms or everybody's polling processes do differ, and they can always defend them. But I think some of the data that emerges leaves you a bit concerned. And in fact, it was the South African National Editors Forum that came out, I think, last week that says, wait, hold on, there seems to be a problem here where everybody just releases polling data that doesn't seem to be making sense in relation to what we understand about the polling dynamics in South Africa and the voter dynamics. And I think they haven't said it out loud, but I think they were triggered by that poll that seemed to suddenly vault the MK into the second or the third most important party in the country on the basis that it just has one face. And I just think it probably isn't that straightforward. So we have to watch the data. And I think, Simon, you will know that at the end of the election cycle, we all know that the CSIR data is actually the one poll that has the greatest levels of accuracy. But for some odd reason, they only engage, I think, within the week of the election. They do not engage in pre-election gimmicks, which is a great pity, because I think they've got systems that are far more robust than any other polling agency, and you can always map what they say versus what the actual outcomes are. I don't know what the secret is, but yeah, they seem to have mastered it.
Yeah, I agree with you. They have got a secret. Maybe we need someone like a Nate Silver and a 538, which can sort of aggregate and weight the polls for things such as it's also important points like, the actual turnout on the day matters. What did you assume around that? How have you modeled it? Was it telephonic, in person? Hundreds of questions around polling. Jason, I want to bring it down to some really nitty gritty at this point, and undoubtedly you and your colleagues at Old Mutual Investment Group are having these sort of conversations on a daily basis. How are you positioning portfolios ahead of this? I mean, are you going ultra careful in looking at bonds and cash? Are you looking at some more resilient or immune to potential outcomes in that regard? How is you guys positioning ahead of it?
I think from an asset allocation, we still have a preference to SA nominal bonds. We have been trimming some of that, into the election, just to reflect, I guess, some cautiousness around what the policy implications are post-election. On the SA side, I think the big decision you want to make is whether you embrace the kind of discount and risk premium in SA Inc. or domestic-facing SA equities. I think there's huge potential there for re-rating, and I think a lot of the, let's say, banks and retailers have some tailwinds going into the second part of the year around interest rate cuts. And then I think the big decision is, do you hedge some of that positioning? So we have been kind of pro some of the domestic SA facing sectors, just because the valuation has been very attractive. And we do think that they could have some tailwinds. You're also going to see a bit of consumption boost from two-pot system kind of later this year. So I think a lot of those could line up for SA for SA assets specifically to outperform, but you need to pair that with hedging those. So we have been focusing on, how do you hedge a SA risk event that is potentially negative, and there we've been looking at currency hedges specifically. So our view has been that there could be some sort of positive surprise and unlock of value, specifically on SA assets and SA facing SA assets, but that will be limited to a cyclical recovery, and that the long-term kind of secular story is still quite negative, because we are worried about potential growth and the lack of, I think, growth enhancing reforms coming through, particularly even if you have a base case view around ANC just below 50 and smaller parties. The reforms that you need to improve unemployment and improve kind of Transnet Eskom, will take still some time. And so the SA story really becomes an issue of, can it unlock value in the short kind of cyclical environment? And that is where we kind of have positioned portfolios with some sort of protection on top of that.
I take your point, Jason, because I mean, we're talking around the election here. It is a big event in the life of South Africans and in South Africa as a country. But of course, there's a whole lot else happening out there, which is that we still have high interest rates and inflation, which is back in the target range, but which is high. We still have a consumer who is struggling, an economy which is struggling with logistic and power challenges, and those don't. Those are happening regardless of the election. And even if we got a new party on the 30th of May, they're not going to flick a switch and things will improve immediately. It's going to be a slow grind. It is a difficult economy, and as you remind us a couple of times today, a practically zero growth economy.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot that could still be done. Eskom is starting to turn around slowly. Transnet is a huge, I would say, government's biggest policy headache. And I saw some numbers recently that, in terms of the GDP impact of Transnet alone was around 6% in 2022, 5% last year. You've seen some positive incremental changes there slowly from new leadership. Coal exports are starting to pick up a little bit. Business leadership was starting to sponsor kind of new leadership coming back into Transnet. So I think those kind of long-term, from an energy and logistics perspective, those are the kind of changes that we need. They're not going to happen overnight. They're not going to happen in the next 1 or 2 years. They also need a little bit more debt relief, which I think is obviously contentious with National Treasury. But that long-term roadmap for us is really important for us to have a more positive view around global growth. And I think that's what global investors are looking for as well, is not to be stagnating around 0.5%, 1% GDP growth, and that we lift that to 1.5%, 2%. And these are the necessary reforms that we need to do, and government and private sector needs to step in to be able to have that happen.
Khaya, if I come back to you, and I'm going to make an assumption here, and if I'm wrong, you shoot me down, but the assumption is that post 29 May, the ANC will still be the biggest party and will able to form a coalition. We're unlikely to get a coalition without the ANC, is my base case. Taking that as a given, and assuming that the ANC somewhere in the 40s, maybe mid, maybe high 40s, do they take this as a lesson? Does the ANC use this to self-reflect? Do they use it to re-bring up the renewal which our president brought 5 odd years ago with the first Nasrec victory against Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma? Do they self-reflect, or is that almost beyond? And I got to say, and I look at some of the ANC members, it seems beyond the ANC. But is there a chance that this gives them a bit of humility and that we get a better ANC for the next 5 years?
They should, but they probably won't. And I think the distinction between those is that, unfortunately, after the 29th of May, the diminishing currency of Cyril Ramaphosa becomes a new problem. In that, obviously, because he would have delivered the ANC to 2 elections and he cannot stand for a 3rd term as an ANC president, the shift suddenly moves on to trying to identify who's going to be the leader of the ANC at the next conference. And that tends to seem to create new distractions for the party. Now, obviously, if he then emerges as the president after the 29th of May, and then he says, look, guys, the only way for us to get back to 50% and above beyond 2029 is for us to do these 2 or 3 or 4 things differently, and that requires an overhaul of the system at large, then that might ignite the process. Now, what ANC presidents always suffer from is what we refer to as a first-term paralysis. And what happens in that first-term paralysis is that what one doesn't want to do is that you don't want to alienate some of the constituencies before, if you're still going to need them to get a second term as an ANC president. So you'll see how Ramaphosa basically did nothing in relation to the various competing ideological differences and factions within the ANC, because as a person who, for example, had come in on the strength of the Labour vote at Nasrec version 1, this is not the person who was going to call out Labour for some of the problems that it created in some of his elements of his reform agenda. So he spent the first 5 years essentially trying to avoid alienating anyone. And of course, once you've won that term, then you may have a bit more latitude to then say, well, actually, I want to do particular things differently. I want to be a bit bolder in some of these initiatives. And we are hoping that after 29 May, he gets that new momentum to say, well, I've got nothing to lose. If he still feels that actually he's still hamstrung by the architecture of the party, then it will simply mean that the ANC will waste the next 3 years focusing on its internal factions of trying to find who the next successor is, without actually addressing the institutional architecture that has created so many of its problems. And that, of course, would be a loss of opportunity if they did not seek to then reflect and say, well, actually, the problems that we have, how were they created and how are we addressing them? There's also obviously the risk of this potential collaboration with the EFF, because that seems to hinge on a singular demand by Julius Malema that the president has to vacate office. And I do not think that it will be in the ANC's interest to cede to that demand, because once you cede to a demand of that nature that says that your own president must be sacrificed in order for you to retain a portfolio of cabinet positions, it's on a slippery slope, mainly because what it will say to a lot of ANC members to say, wait, hold on, as a member of the ANC, the waiting list for elevation into the highest levels of office was way too long. It was millions long, for example. However, if you form these breakaway factions, whether it is be the MK or whether it's the EFF, then the pathway to those particular positions is much shorter. So therefore, it creates an incentive for some of the ANC members to say, well, actually, it feels like we can still be part of this leadership collective without having to wait for 10 or 20 years because the ANC list is too long. So therefore, many more people will say, I want to be part of these structures that seem to be running as parallel or co-governance partners of the ANC, and that's very dangerous for the ANC, because by 2029 it probably won't exist as a party that is as strong as it is right now, if it allows people to believe that actually the best way to guarantee yourself a position is to essentially position yourself as a parallel partner rather than a member of the ANC that is subject to this long, lengthy process of waiting whilst all of these old 70 and 80-year-olds refuse to leave political office.
Yeah, I take point on that 100%. And Jason, that then brings me to a degree to the previous question I asked you, but with a bit more nuance. Are we then, in a sense, almost, we're looking at this 29 May election as a giant event in our country? And it is, let's make no mistake, it's a national election. There's a good chance that the ruling party goes below 50% for the first time. We've got the coalition partners who's sort of building up around it. But perhaps the bigger issue is actually going to be 2029. And as you said, the bigger issues right now is that logistics, is Eskom, is the governor and his MPC committee and interest rates and inflation targets. And I don't mean this in any way in a negative sense, but the ANC's, so the election rather, is almost a distraction on the bigger journey that we need as an economy to get to that 2, 3, 4. I mean, I remember the Mbeki days of 5% GDP growth.
Yeah, I do think 2024 is going to be a testing ground for the next set of elections, and particularly with, intermingling that with coalition politics on a national level. So there's no doubt in my mind that the way that we make South Africa a more attractive destination is to lift that potential growth number. And whether it's 1.5 or 2, I definitely think we need to get to 2.5 or 3%, because then you get this virtuous circle of better employment, more investment, better confidence, a stronger consumer base, and slowly kind of tick away at some of the structural issues around education and unemployment. I do think that 2029 will also be more prepared for coalition politics, because from a legislation perspective, we'll be able to put in more guidelines around coalition frameworks, which will help partnerships in government be a little bit more effective. And you kind of see this a little bit with the disarray on the municipality level, where there's tons of flip-flopping and maneuvering and reneging. And once we kind of think about how 2024 plays out in terms of the policy implications, and have a lot of those entities stabilize and understand what the implications are for 2029, and build a little bit more regulation and tighter frameworks around coalitions, then I think the kind of long-term picture for our growth outlook and our fiscal outlook and the stability around monetary policy, I think that will bode well for the potential to lift our trend growth higher, which we desperately need.
Are our political parties better positioned? I wanted to say mature enough, but better positioned is perhaps a better word, for coalitions. Have we learned, and by we I mean the political parties, have they learned from I don't know how many mayors we've had in Joburg now in the last, since the 2021 election, which was just 3 years ago, the challenges in Ekurhuleni and other parts of the country as well. Are the political parties going to be better at coalition? Because in many senses, 21 was the first sort of real test, and that was at city level, so it's different, but it was still the sort of first real test, and in many cases, they scored very poorly.
I think they've seen enough, and I don't know if that means they've learned enough. And when we say they've seen enough, is that South Africa's coalitions actually started way back in 2006, but the reason it seemed to have escalated into crisis mode in 2016 and 2021 is that suddenly it was in the metros, which is obviously the high budget locations, where suddenly people then wanted to figure out, well, if you are in this co-governance model, what is it within this co-governance model that you control, and why does it matter what it is that you control? So you can imagine that everybody wants to say that of the 10 positions of MMCs that are there, I want to be able to be in control of the ones that have the highest number of municipal agencies and municipal entities, because it comes with particular budgets. But also what it does is that it creates a system where you can reward those that got you there. So if you can imagine in the city of Johannesburg and the many municipal entities that we have and the boards of director positions that exist out there, you want to be able to say, well, the more of those I can get, the more of my own people I can reward. So that's what created these tensions around the contestation there. And I think beyond the question of fighting for resources, it is still very possible for these co-governance models to yield results that say, well, a budget has to be passed eventually. And I think obviously what we will have to figure out is how the fate of the national ballot impacts on the coexisting co-governance structure. So you can imagine, for example, that if we emerge after 29 May and there is a coalition or some model between the ANC and the DA. Now that has implications for what already exists in some of these metros where different models or different arrangements have been put in place. So obviously one of the bargaining chips would be to say, well, if we're going to collaborate with you at that level, we will demand that you give us some breathing space at that particular municipal structure of that metro structure. So there will be a knock-on effect in relation to that. So they've seen a lot. Whether they've actually taken the positive lessons from that, something that is unclear, because we still have these ongoing debacles. I think the latest one is the city of Ekurhuleni, where we might, at the end of this call, have a new mayor because there seems to be an inability for people to know how to work towards the common good. I think obviously the last point on that is that this has been acknowledged by the ANC itself, and a few months ago, the deputy president actually convened a gathering in Cape Town where people are then being asked to canvass different ideas on how a co-governance model should look like after the elections. Do we need new laws? Do we need new benchmarks? Do we need new guardrails in order to secure the governance of the country beyond that particular date? And obviously, it's still speculative at this stage. And I think obviously after we get to 29 May and that becomes the way in which things need to be done, you will see a development of new arrangements, institutional arrangements, and also even some new policy shifts that will then say, well, this looks like an irreversible trend, because it's unlikely that anyone will imagine that something's going to happen between now and 2029 that gives them absolute power. So everybody has to come across the table and figure out how to make this work. And obviously everybody will be trying to get the best outcome for them that positions them as the party that made a coalition work rather than collapse. And I don't think anyone wants to be known as the one that collapsed the coalition, because it will have significant implications for the next local government election and ultimately 2029.
Yeah, and I take your point. I'm showing my Joburg bias. I'd forgotten about the Khaya Nelson Mandela 2016 coalition, which was immensely fractious. A last question as we wrap up for each of you. Jason, on the morning of the 30th, and we'll get results coming through on the 30th, but of course coalitions will take some time to formalize. Is there a data point on the economic front that you are watching? Is it volumes on the JSE? Is it the Rand? Is it our bonds? What sort of will you be? I mean, obviously the markets as a whole matter, but is there a single data point that you will be perhaps watching closer than others?
I would say probably the best barometer for the outcome of the election will probably be the currency. It's fairly liquid. Global investors are trading the currency constantly, and that pretty much reflects, I would guess, the risk appetite towards South Africa as a currency. So. Yeah, I mean, bond yields might also price in a little bit of that, because that whatever the policy outcomes, feeds through directly into fiscal and monetary policy. But I think just from a tradability, the Rand will probably be the best reflection of what the perception is in terms of how the elections, what the outcome of the elections are. So that's probably where I'm keeping my eye on the keenest.
Yeah, I take your point 100%. I mean, 2 data points from last year, grey listing in February, Lady R in the middle of the year. It was the Rand that is almost how people vote on our country. Khaya, for you, come 30 May, we should be getting some solid results by the end of the 30th, the day after. We'll get a sense of where it is. What's the one thing that you're going to be looking to check to see if it has or hasn't happened? Is it the ANC under 50? Is it MK? Because I take your point at 13%, which didn't make a lot of sense. What's going to be the data point that you will first turn to?
I think the two most important data points for me will be Gauteng, and it will also be KZN from the provincial perspective, and also the question of the turnout, because if the ANC is to fall below 50%, it will simply mean that the provinces of Gauteng and KZN have been the ones that have turned decisively against the ANC and then managed it to and then get it to fall below that 50% mark. I think the rest of the provinces are probably going to remain as they were. In other words, whoever won them in 2019 will likely win them in 2024. But I think Gauteng and KZN are where the swing might be. And of course, depending on how well the other political parties craft their message over the next 8 weeks, then that will not only determine the question of participation on the day, but also the simple question of what people then decide to do when they're confronted for the first time with these 3 ballots, where some people might then say, well, actually, you need to pick one party across all 3 instead of splitting your ballot, because once you split it, there may even be a more parallelized system. So KZN and Gauteng for me will be the one that determine where we go.
Yeah, and of course, turnout in those provinces then also directly have a significant point. We'll leave it there. Khaya Sithole, independent social political commentator, really appreciate your insights today. And Jason Swartz, portfolio manager, Old Mutual Investment Group. Your insights, gentlemen, really have a great conversation. I learned a ton. I think it's going to be a fairly wild couple of months before we get to that election. But I think robust democracy, this is what democracy is, and I think it's good that we can at least debate it. We get to vote. We have no sense that there won't be a fair election and that the outcome won't be a reflection of the people, and I think we need to be proud of that and remember that this is something which in our democracy is only 30 years old. 30 years is a long time, but in South Africa's history, it's been the short end of the period where we've had that proper democracy. To ladies and gents who attended the session today, really appreciate your time. The session has been recorded. The link will go out if you want to review it. Jason, Khaya, thank you very much. Ladies and gents, have a great day further. Everyone, look after yourself, and if you can, look after somebody else as well. Cheers all.